100% tariffs on every single Canadian product entering the United States. Not on China, not on electric vehicles, not on a single sector, on everything. That was the threat issued on a Saturday morning. No warning, no consultation, no legal pathway, just a blunt declaration that if Canada dares to make a trade deal with China, its entire economy will be punished. This was not framed as leverage. This was framed as annihilation. And here is where the story immediately breaks from anything that makes sense. The deal being used as justification for this threat was not secret. It was not new. It had already been announced. It had already been explained, and it had already been publicly praised. Just days earlier, the same agreement was described as smart, reasonable, and exactly what a country should be doing to protect its own interests. Nothing about the deal changed. No new clauses, no hidden amendments, no escalation from Beijing. Yet suddenly, the identical agreement was rebranded as an existential threat, a betrayal, a justification for economic warfare. So this is the question that matters, and it must be answered before anything else. How does a trade deal go from a good thing to grounds for economic destruction in 8 days? Not 8 months, not after new evidence, not after damage was done. 8 days. The answer is not found in trade law. It is not found in customs rules. It is not found in economics. It is found in a single moment on a global stage when Canada stopped pretending to be subordinate. And once you see that moment clearly, the threat stops looking like strength. It starts looking like panic. Let's strip this down to the timeline, because the timeline exposes everything. January 16th. A bilateral trade agreement between Canada and China is announced after direct talks in Beijing. The agreement is narrow, targeted, technical. It addresses specific trade irritants that had been hurting Canadian farmers for over a year. The public reaction from Washington is not hostile. It is not defensive. It is approving. The message is simple. That is what a country should do: negotiate, protect its interests, find markets where it can. No warnings, no threats, no talk of punishment. 4 days later, January 20th, Canada's Prime Minister steps onto the stage at the World Economic Forum in Davos. This is not a trade briefing. This is not a technical address. This is a strategic declaration. He does not announce new tariffs. He does not threaten retaliation. He does not even mention the United States by name. Instead, he delivers a message that lands like a seismic shift. He tells the assembled political and economic elite that the old international order is no longer functioning, that tariffs are no longer tools of policy, but tools of coercion, that financial systems and supply chains are being weaponized by great powers, and that middle-sized countries can no longer rely on goodwill or rules alone to protect themselves. Then comes the line that changes everything. If you are not at the table, you are on the menu. The room understands immediately what that means, who it is about, why it matters. The next day, the response comes. The tone is no longer approving. It is no longer cooperative. It is not even diplomatic. Canada is described as dependent, as ungrateful, as living because of someone else's generosity. This is no longer about trade. This is about hierarchy. And 4 days after that, January 24th, the threat is issued. 100% tariffs, total punishment, immediate consequences. Nothing changed in Beijing. Nothing changed in the agreement. Nothing changed in the numbers. What changed was that Canada explained out loud to the world why it was making choices independently. The timeline makes one thing unavoidable. This was not retaliation for a deal. It was punishment for a declaration of autonomy. And once you understand that, the threat begins to collapse under its own weight. What made that speech in Davos so dangerous was not its tone. It was calm, measured, almost academic. What made it dangerous was that it named the system as broken without naming the country breaking it. The message was delivered with precision. The world is not going through a transition. It is going through a rupture. For decades, globalization was sold as mutual benefit. Interdependence was supposed to make conflict irrational. Supply chains were supposed to bind countries together in shared prosperity. But that promise, he argued, no longer holds. Because great powers learned something else. They learned that tariffs can be used as weapons, that access to financial systems can be turned into leverage, that supply chains can be transformed into choke points. Integration, once a source of stability, has become a tool of control. That is the moment the room shifted. Because this was not theory, this was a description of the present. When you talk about tariffs being used as coercion while one country is openly threatening tariffs against allies to force political compliance, no one in the audience is confused about who you are talking about. When you warn that countries must stop assuming that market access will always be there tomorrow, every finance minister in the room thinks about the same risk. And then came the line that locked it in. Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. That sentence traveled faster than any policy paper. It reframed global power not as ideology, but as vulnerability. It told countries that rules would not save them, that goodwill would not save them, that only options would. Build strength at home, diversify partnerships abroad. Engage with the world as it is, not as you wish it were. This was not an anti-American speech. It was something far more threatening. It was a declaration that American leverage is no longer absolute. The standing ovation that followed was not polite. It was rare, and it was noticed. The response came the next day, and it could not have been more revealing. The tone shifted instantly. Canada was no longer described as a partner. It was described as dependent. The language was not about policy. It was about obedience. Canada lives because of us. Canada gets freebies. Canada should remember its place. This was not economic analysis. It was a demand for deference. Because when someone says a country lives because of you, they are not describing trade flows. They are asserting ownership. The subtext was unmistakable. Autonomy was acceptable as long as it was quiet. Negotiation was acceptable as long as it did not challenge hierarchy. The moment independence was articulated publicly, cooperation became disobedience. That is why the reaction was emotional, not technical. There was no breakdown of the deal's terms, no reference to actual re-export risks, no evidence presented. Instead, there was language of ingratitude and punishment. Calling a prime minister a governor was not accidental. It was symbolic. It was a reminder of how power was expected to flow, from the center outward, from authority to subordinate, from permission to compliance. And that is why the response from Canada mattered so much. It was calm, it was controlled, and it refused the premise entirely. Canada does not live because of anyone else. Canada thrives because it governs itself. This is our country. This is our future. That was the moment the old script broke, because once a middle power refuses to accept the language of dependency, the tools of persuasion run out, and when persuasion fails, threats follow. The tariff threat was not the start of the conflict. It was the admission that the conflict had already been lost. The response was not loud. That was what made it dangerous. There was no retaliation announced, no counter-threats, no appeal to emotion, just a refusal to accept the premise. Canada acknowledged the partnership, the history, the shared economy, the shared security framework, and then drew a line. Canada does not exist because of anyone else. Canada exists because Canadians built it. This country governs itself. This future will be chosen here. That statement did something subtle but irreversible. It removed fear from the equation. For decades, the unspoken assumption was that Canada could disagree quietly, but never openly, that independence could be practiced, but not proclaimed, that autonomy was acceptable only as long as it did not challenge the narrative of dependency. This response shattered that rule. It told the world that Canada was no longer asking permission to diversify its relationships. It was explaining why it must. And that distinction matters. Asking permission implies hierarchy. Explanation implies sovereignty. From that moment forward, the situation could no longer be managed through tone or symbolism. The issue was no longer trade, it was control. Because once a country publicly asserts that it will no longer shape its economy around another country's approval, the leverage that depended on silence disappears. That is why the next move was not negotiation, it was escalation. The threat sounded absolute. 100% tariffs, every product, immediate effect. But when you examine it closely, the threat collapses. There is no legal mechanism for imposing permanent blanket tariffs of that scale without legislative approval. There is no pathway that bypasses existing trade agreements without triggering formal disputes. There is no scenario where such a move does not violate binding commitments already in force. And there is no version of this threat that does not devastate domestic industries first. Canadian exports are not abstract numbers. They are inputs American companies rely on every day. Energy that heats homes, lumber that builds houses, metals that feed manufacturing lines, parts that keep factories running. Doubling those costs overnight would not punish Canada in isolation. It would ripple through supply chains, consumer prices, employment, and inflation inside the United States itself. Which raises the obvious question, why issue a threat that cannot realistically be carried out? Because execution was never the goal. The purpose was uncertainty. If companies cannot trust that access to a market will remain stable, they delay investment. If producers cannot predict tariff exposure, they reduce output. If investors believe trade rules can be rewritten on impulse, they look elsewhere. The threat was designed to shake confidence, not to be implemented. But here is the paradox. That very uncertainty proves the argument made in Davos. It demonstrates that reliance on a single market is a vulnerability, not a strength. It confirms that economic integration can be turned into coercion without warning. It validates the need for diversification, not submission. The threat was meant to force compliance. Instead, it revealed why compliance is no longer rational. And once that realization sets in, the threat loses its power. This was never about electric vehicles. It was never about China using Canada as a transit route. And it was never about trade enforcement. It was about choice. For decades, leverage worked because there were no alternatives. Canada routed most of its trade south because the infrastructure, the markets, and the systems were designed that way. Threats worked because dependence made them credible. When access to one market determines survival, pressure becomes power. That is the structure now being dismantled. Every new buyer for Canadian agriculture weakens that structure. Every new export route that bypasses American infrastructure reduces that leverage. Every diversified supply chain removes one more pressure point. The China agreement was not radical by itself. It was modest, technical, limited. But it represented something far more threatening than its economic scale. It demonstrated that Canada can negotiate independently, that it can prioritize domestic industries without seeking approval, that it can survive disagreement. That is what provoked panic. Because once one middle-sized economy proves that alternatives are viable, others start asking questions. If Canada can do this without collapsing, why not us? If dependence is optional, why tolerate coercion? This is what breaks systems of dominance, not confrontation, but example. The fear was never that Canada would fail. The fear was that Canada would succeed.
Other countries were watching this unfold in real time. Not just allies, not just rivals, but every government that has ever been told to accept pressure quietly for the sake of stability. They saw a country negotiate a limited trade deal, they saw it praised, they saw it articulate a doctrine of autonomy, and then they saw it threatened with total economic punishment. The lesson was not subtle. Reliability is conditional. Rules apply until they do not, and pressure escalates the moment independence is made visible. For many governments, this confirmed something they already suspected, that diversification is no longer optional, that relying on a single dominant market is a strategic risk, that resilience now requires redundancy. This is why the response matters beyond Canada. If the threat fails, it weakens the very tactic it relies on. If coercion does not restore obedience, it teaches resistance. If escalation produces alternatives, it accelerates the erosion of dominance. This is how influence decays, not in collapse, but in diffusion. Every time pressure is applied without consequence, it teaches others that pressure can be endured. And that is the future this threat was meant to prevent. Return to the central contradiction. On January 16th, the agreement was praised. On January 24th, it justified economic warfare. Nothing in the agreement changed, nothing in the numbers changed, nothing in the markets changed. Only one thing did. Canada explained openly and publicly that the agreement was part of a broader strategy to reduce vulnerability to coercion. That explanation transformed a transaction into a statement, and statements expose power. The 100% tariff threat was not a display of strength, it was an admission. It admitted that leverage depends on dependence, that obedience depends on fear, and that once fear fades, escalation is the only remaining tool. But escalation does not restore control, it reveals its limits. By threatening everything, the threat proved it had nothing left to offer. No incentives, no persuasion, no shared vision, only punishment. And punishment is not leadership. What was meant to force submission instead confirmed the need for autonomy. What was meant to deter diversification accelerated it. What was meant to project dominance exposed fragility. That is why this moment matters. Not because of a trade deal, not because of tariffs, but because a middle power refused to stay silent and in doing so forced a reaction that revealed exactly how the system now works. This was not strength, it was panic.